I don't think that there's a moral equivalency between telling or encouraging people to have children versus doing the opposite, because I think one of them is pro-human and one of them is anti-human. This is not saying people should be forced or bullied or have some type of law or something like that to kind of force them into fatherhood or motherhood. But I think that those different mindsets come from very different places. I would say that in any successful culture, anywhere in the world, religious or irreligious, up until 5 minutes ago, it was always the case that there is pressure on every generation to create another generation. Has that been done in some bad ways? Yeah, sure, right? There are people who've taken that a little too far, but I think that generally speaking, that is good and is necessary, because we as human beings, we all live in a culture. And the truth is, most people do what the cultural norms are, whatever that may be. So if you have a cultural narrative telling people that it is selfish or it's bad for the environment or it's terrible or you're a bad person or whatever, if you reproduce, if you choose to pass on your genetics and keep the species going, I think that's far, far worse than the opposite. I think the opposite comes from a very good place. It can be overbearing, but I'd say that is more the exception rather than the rule. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah, so I do have a perspective in this, and for me, it's actually quite an important one. I actually came up with a terminology because a lot of people were labeling me, pronatalist, or I was called feminist and anti-feminist in the same week, and I don't like labels. So I came up with this term, panatalist, and because it's my term, I get to define it. So a panatalist is someone who supports those who want to have children to have the children that they want to have. And to enable that in terms of governmental policies or whatever it is, but equally protects those, I use that term, who really don't have the desire to have children. I mean, one reason for that is that they'd probably not make great parents. But I think where the nuance might be different is when you look at real data. There's a lot of really flimsy surveys out there that kind of are part of this ideological problem that twists the truth. But if you look at real data, somewhere around 92, 93, 95% of women either are mothers or want to become mothers, under 35. Mm-hmm. And it's actually a very small minority who simply never get that desire. And in making the documentary, I sat down with 5 of those women who had never had the desire and had no regrets. And one was a school teacher. In fact, 2 of them, I think, were school teachers. They're giving to their communities, I think, oftentimes in other ways. And because it is a smaller group, thankfully to me, we don't have to put ourselves in a position of trying to guilt these people. In fact, that will backfire, I believe, because, quite rightly, they will say it's not for them. That's how I view it. But the reality is, if the 90+% of women who want children were having the number of children they wanted, we wouldn't be in this situation. We're only in this situation because of a huge increase of what I call unplanned childlessness. People who intended to become mothers, but life got in the way. But that's where the documentary gets to. And that was, I think I need to talk, more boldly than I have in the past, but no one had researched that before. No one had identified the importance of unplanned childlessness in tipping us into this position of below replacement fertility.
I think one of the big problems is that statistic you said, which is maybe between, let's say, 5 to 10% of women genuinely not wanting to have children. I think we live in a society and a culture where people are led to believe that number is more like 30 to 50%. When it's absolutely not, right? There are exceptions to everything, right? We know this, and I think one of the big issues we're having, particularly in the West, and it can make conversations quite difficult sometimes, is there's this, I call it the sort of obsession with exceptions. There's always an immediate wanting to jump to the, you might have a situation where it's 95-5 and people want to spend all the time talking about the 5 rather than addressing the 95. I recognize, look, human beings are extraordinarily diverse. There's 8 billion people out there. You can't really make any, if I say that, hey, people have 10 fingers, someone's going to jump out and say, oh, well, actually there's some people who are born with 8 fingers, or sometimes someone loses a hand. And I recognize that, but I'm always like, let's focus on the 90 to 99%. And then, yeah, of course, look, if you live in a free society, even in an unfree society, no one is really trying to like make the idea that someone's trying to like force people to have children is not really a thing. It's a bit of a straw man. Yeah, there can be pressures, but no one is like out there trying to make a law that's mandating that people, have children. That's not really a position.
Yeah, I think it's arguably it may come to that in some countries. I certainly that's not the case anywhere right now. But there are situations. Iran has a very low birth rate that shocks a lot of people. I believe it's 1.6, 1.7, certainly in Tehran. And 2-3 years ago, they banned vasectomies. So there can be ways that states do endeavor to manipulate their population, which I think we need to be guarded against. But your core point is absolutely right. Most people think that the majority of childless people, men and women, had either medical issues or planned to be childless. It is absolutely not true. So in those nations that have been going through long-term low birth rates for decades, much of Europe, Japan, around 4 out of 5 childless people had intended, wanted, hoped for a family. That's 80%.
Yep.
And that fits with academics. It fits with the desire that 90% plus people do want children. The US right now, if I could just comment, because I've had pushback, because in the US, people are saying, well, that's not the case in the US. But the reality is, childlessness is quite a new thing in the US. It was triggered around 07, 08. Childlessness before the mortgage crisis shock. And I do find crises a major trigger in changing societies. In the US, it was around 15% of women were childless. Today, the societal level, as I measure, is heading towards 37%. And it's not quite measured that way yet, because there's a lot of women, late 30s, early 40s in the US, still hoping to be mothers. And a few will. But if you look at the trends, reality, we can estimate really quite accurately that really a small minority of that group ever will. So my point is, in some countries who are going through the transition, they haven't quite, been able to understand the levels of childlessness working through their systems, such as the US. But your core point is right. This is probably the most surprising thing in the documentary, that actually unplanned childlessness is driving low birth rates. That shocks a lot of people.
Yeah, absolutely. When I watched it, that was like a mind-blowing moment to me. I've thought the overpopulation thing is a psyop my entire life. I've always thought that the idea that, there's too many people in the world or whatever, I've always thought that that's nonsense.
If you come to Japan, where I live, and you were to say that, you get a lot of stares, because right now, hiring people, decaying communities, elderly people living in their own, there's a lot of loneliness. There's a lot of deep problems caused by this. So you have to tell me where you think there's too many people, and then we can have a conversation. They'll probably say sub-Saharan Africa, and then we can have a conversation, because the only reason for that is it's a young continent, and in parts there's still a lot of extreme poverty, and that's when people do tend to have larger families. But birth rates are falling across sub-Saharan Africa at almost frightening rates. I mean, Ethiopia, Malawi, families are having one fewer child every decade. So Africa's on the same path. So you can't just say there's too many people. That's like trying to close down a conversation rather than actually get into the nitty gritty. So,
do you know where a lot of this conversation comes from? I think that belief of overpopulation, because I've noticed a trend, and this is totally anecdotal, but I'm sure somebody could actually do some type of survey on this if they wanted to. I have found that the majority of people who seem to really believe this includes people that I've met and had conversations with. It's always people who live in like LA, New York, London. It's people who live in like very densely populated, very highly populated cities who have this view. It's never people who live in Arkansas or who live in Devon or who live in Cornwall. I've noticed this trend. If I talk to people from London, they're maybe the majority of people, if this topic comes up, they're always like, of course there's too many people, because in their day-to-day life, there's some type of cognitive bias, right? Because in their own environment, I mean, you could make an argument that London is overpopulated. You can make an argument that Beijing or Tokyo or LA or New York, you could make an argument that makes more sense that these places are overpopulated. You look at the traffic, you look at rush hour. But then if you fly across the USA and you look down, the country is empty. I mean, you could fit the whole world in Texas.
Yeah. So it's at best, it's vastly overly simplistic to say there's too many people. And your point on urbanization is right. So one of my own, this is a prediction, but I've seen it happening whereby even in communities or countries where the total population is shrinking, and population in Japan's been shrinking for 10 or more years, people still gravitate towards the urban areas. That will always be the case. In fact, I think more and more people will be attracted to more attractive, what I call magnet towns within a region. The one area where young people want to live, where there's still, a bank open if we need banks, or there's a car servicing station, etc. Whilst the other towns in that area may decay. Now, those are still going to be, urbanized areas. So if you're living in that bubble, you will never see the reality of what's happening, probably not very far away.